Welcome to the Squared Circle Pit with your host, Rob Pasbani.
Now entering the Squared Circle Pit. We're excited to have Nick Miller from the reuniting Flesh and Bot Robot. I want to mention you have a big reunion show coming up March 17th in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the Pyramid Scheme. From a Second Story Window, Nights Like These, Heartsick, Dust Spider, Strangers, all on the bill with Flesh and Blood Robot. It took 18 years for you guys to come back together. Did one of you have a kid? Is that what it is? They're now out of out of the house?
Actually, our bass player does have a kid, and he actually just had the kid. So he's still fairly young. Like, we all just kind of went and had to live some lives for a little while and do some things. And then I met up with Fox mid last year for like a promotion with work, in his band. And, he was just like, oh yeah, people have been asking about stuff that's going on with Flesh and Blood. They want us to re-release the record and maybe put the CD out or something. And I had been in an active band at the time, still am. And then I had like maybe a month and a half prior to that, I was hanging out with Nico. He was in town. And he was telling me about his band, and like, Strangers was a great band. And so I told Chris, I was just like, that 3 out of 5 of us are active and playing music again. If you wanted to do something, I'm sure that we could figure out how to do it. And he was like, talk to the guys and see if they're interested. And everybody was down, so we made it happen.
That's awesome. And so how long were you guys active initially?
2002 to 2006. So 4.5 years. But we were also like in a nu metal band for a couple of years that transitioned to Flesh and Blood Robot. So we all started a band like when I think I was 16, Eric was 15, Fox was 17, and then we were a 6-piece. So we had 2 singers at the time. And then in my senior year in 2002, that was when we transitioned and changed our band name.
Interesting. So what, like, just your musical tastes evolving, caused the transition, or what was it?
Yeah. Well, so like I said, we had 2 singers. So one of our singers wanted to leave. He wasn't interested in being in the band anymore. And then our other guitar player wanted to leave. And they wanted to go and start a side project. So we wished them all the luck. They're still friends of ours. The guitar player that left the band, his name's Matt Dunn. He's actually does this project called Super Nuclear, which is like he does like that old, like 60s, 70s style projection art. But obviously it's cool. Modernized now with like super high-end HD projectors and, really nice cameras and all kinds of weird glitch and, camera equipment, stuff like that. But he's actually going to be performing at the show. He's going to be doing lights for all the bands and like kind of like setting up the atmosphere for the room. So they're also like close friends. But yeah, they wanted to leave. Our musical taste had kind of shifted, like we had started to discover a lot more like hardcore music, screamo, metalcore, stuff like that. And we were starting to write music that sounded more like that stuff and less like the nu metal stuff. And I think that was kind of like where those guys wanted to go and keep playing more like nu metal, traditional metal stuff. And we wanted to go more towards like the hardcore, like Norma Jean and Poison the Well and, like those bands that we were falling in love with. That was kind of like, if you listen to the record, that's like the first 3 songs. Those were the transitionary songs. Those were originally One Away from Breathing songs that we turned into Flesh and Blood Robot songs later.
That's really interesting because I feel like I had a very similar trajectory as well. Like I was very much into nu metal in high school, Limp Bizkit, Korn, so on. And then as I got to college and made some new friends who were a little more involved in the scene, I found myself I was introduced to all sorts of underground metal, like, the European stuff, like the more traditional heavy metal. But like I found myself leaning towards or gravitating towards the mathcore kind of, hardcore influenced stuff. So well, you said you guys sounded like a nu metal band. What nu metal sound were you going for initially?
I mean, we were really obsessed with Mudvayne and Slipknot. Like we were really, really into those bands. Obviously, like Korn, and I like the first Limp Bizkit album a lot. I still love $3 Bill Y'all. I think it's a great record. So like that, we had like a pretty wide spectrum on the nu metal genre of stuff that we like to listen to. But like me, our drummer at the time and our bass player Eric were all really into like Tool and Mudvayne and some of the more like technical, mathy, like weirdo new metal bands. And so like I think we kind of always were drawn towards some of the more like just like the more techie stuff, like the bounce beats and all of like the rhythm guitars and things like that, like from the new metal world are great, and I love those bands. But I think the stuff that like we really like that was really intriguing to us were the things that were changing time signatures and doing new metal breakdowns. Do you remember there was a Chicago band called 5.0? I don't know if you ever remember
No,
them.
no, I don't.
They were like this cool middle ground between like the hardcore world and new metal. Whenever you get a chance after this, I highly recommend going. They had one record. They probably had like a record before that, before they got signed or whatever, but that record was incredible.
Yeah, and I feel like there's like plenty of natural crossover. Like you think of a band like Snapcase, I feel
Oh
like
yeah,
they're super influential to some of these new metal bands. They don't necessarily sound new metal at all, but the new metal bands that came out that were influential, we're listening to them. So I think it's not as surprising a transition if you really just take a step back and look at what was going on in the music world back then.
oh
Uh,
yeah.
so was new metal like the first metal you listened? Do you remember like the first metal band you discovered? Like how you got into heavier music?
I mean, like, there's always like the classic rock, you know. I think like I fell in love with guitar through Stevie Ray Vaughan and like Jimi Hendrix.
Hmm.
So like then there's like Led Zeppelin. I'm a huge like 80s hair metal fan. Like Twisted Sister is one of my all-time favorite bands. I have Dee Snider tattooed on me. Like
Nice.
I'm big into like the 80s hair metal scene and stuff like that. And to this day, I still try to like figure out how to play a lot of those riffs because that shit was complicated and really, really tough. Um,
Yeah, I think what people like they kind of knock it hair metal, and an aficionado once told me it's not hair metal, all right? We don't use that term. It's glam metal. But
sure.
what I think they did really well, and what maybe is missing in metal today is those are pop songs with heavy riffs. Like
Yeah.
they wrote very, very catchy songs that happen to be heavy. Like I think
Right.
people forget about that or probably don't care about that, when they're writing music today. But I think that's why glam metal resonated with so many people just outside of the metal. Like anybody can get into Twisted Sister, like hip hop fans or whatever,
Yeah.
because it's so catchy.
Yeah. And I think I mean, and it's also the way that they mix those records. Like if you went back and got your hands on some stems for like an old Motley Crue record and you changed the guitar tones around and pushed the cymbals and guitars forward, you'd have a heavy, like a real heavy sounding album compared to like the way that records are mixed modernly.
And literally, Metallica heard those Motley Crue records and were like, "We need that producer to make
Yeah.
our next record." And it was the Black Album, their most successful album ever. So, yeah, absolutely. There's stuff to take away from those, even if you might not necessarily be into the music, just based on how much appeal it had.
But yeah, that was kind of like my introduction to like the metal world was, I had my dad was into Metallica, my uncles were into like a lot of classic rock and stuff like that. And in high school I tend to like those are my friends, like the metalheads and the punks, like the weirdos were, like those are the people that I kind of hung out with and related to. And like I owe my friends at that time a lot for introducing me to a lot of different types of music. The most exposure I had was those CD warehouse catalogs that you would get that just had like listed a shit ton of CDs on them, and I just go through and try to figure out the ones that kind of looked like they were metal, and then I did
Hmm.
that old I'm not 18 thing, so I couldn't legally sign a contract. So when they called trying to collect the money for the CDs, my dad was just like, "Well, you can't legally enter into a contract with a minor," and then they stopped calling.
Oh man, it's so wonderful. Like, yeah, the Columbia House or whatever. I got so much music from there as well as a child before there was the internet to make it easier to bootleg things. But yeah, and yeah, never paid more than 3 cents, or I don't think I even paid anything. Yeah, I
Yeah,
don't know how they
yeah.
made any money.
Yeah, that was funny. I just remember when my friend told me that. They were just like, "Yeah, dude, you're under 18. You can't sign a contract." I was like, "Good point." And then I told my dad that, and he was like, "Yeah, good point. I'm gonna call him and tell him to fuck off."
So let's talk about pro wrestling a little. What's your earliest wrestling memory?
Oh man. I mean, I think I told you this a little bit beforehand when we were emailing, but like my era of wrestling was the Attitude Era. I mean, as a kid, I remember seeing like the old, Hulk Hogan matches and things like that. My grandfather used to record pay-per-view wrestling matches onto
Hmm.
VHS. So when I got old enough to watch them, then I got to rewatch some of the old WrestleManias and things like that and see some of the classic guys. But yeah, my era when I was really into it, when I couldn't miss, a Monday Night Raw, and I played every single wrestling game that came out for Super Nintendo and the N64 was the Attitude Era. I actually got to go to a live filming for Monday Night Raw one time in Detroit when it was like the oddities and DX and ICP and like the heyday of the Attitude Era.
Nice. So how did you like what really got you into it? Do you remember if there was like a specific wrestler or an angle or your friends were just into it? How did you really start diving in?
I had a friend that was really into it, and he watched it all the time, and so like I watched it occasionally. I wasn't like into the drama aspect of it. I didn't know all the stories that was going on with the different wrestlers,
Hmm.
but he knew a lot of them, and so I when I went out hang out with him, it was Monday night, he'd catch me up on all the stories, and then when it was like Steve Austin, like when he kind of went towards like Stone Cold and that transitionary period when The Rock, gosh, I mean, I forget the name of like the collective that he was in, but when he transitioned into being like the solo wrestler,
Yeah, when he went from
that,
Nation of Domination
yeah, yeah,
to
that
just
was
being The
kind of
Rock.
that was when I started to get into it and watch it more regularly. And then when like
Hmm.
when DX kind of hit, because Shawn Michaels was always like I don't know why, but I was always into that dude as a wrestler. I always thought he was super
Same.
entertaining. And then when he joined up with Triple H and they did like the DX thing, I was like, okay, this is really cool. I really like this like punk rock, like fuck you attitude kind of thing that they had going. And then
Hmm.
when they did the war on WCW, I was like, okay, these guys are amazing. Like I was falling out of my chair crying laughing when they rolled up in a tank. To WCW wearing like war fatigues and like the old shitty metal helmets, and I was just crying laughing, and I was like, okay, yeah, these guys rule. And that was also, I think there was like a perfect storm of, like when South Park kind of hit the scene, that was like the era of like Tom Green and like MTV trying to be edgy. And like they started doing that claymation celebrity deathmatch fighting and stuff like that for late night. So it
Yeah.
just seemed like a lot of our general like the culture around entertainment in general was all incestually linked back to WWF at the time. So yeah, it was just, I don't know, it was just fun to be a part of it then. It
Oh,
really kind of felt
absolutely.
like it was taking the world by storm. And then there was also like the fun subgenres because if you got into WWE, then you'd be introduced to characters like Cactus Jack, and then you'd look into his background and you find out about like ECW, and then you start learning about all the background backyard wrestling and stuff like that. And then I actually had friends that did it, so I could go and watch backyard wrestling and seeing how violent and over the top crazy that stuff was. So
So,
yeah, it was a good
so who
time.
were your guys? Was it Shawn Michaels and Cactus Chat? Were those basically the guys your
Uh,
favorite? Like, who were some of your favorites?
Mankind. I was a big fan of Mankind. I loved like his multiple personality stuff. So like Dude Love, when he brought back Cactus Jack was just awesome. And then obviously everything that DX did, every member of DX was awesome in some sort of way, shape or form. I loved the call outs that they had. They all had their taglines that they would do before they'd introduce their matches, whether they were together or separate. They all had different ones. So like those guys were my favorites. And then obviously like Steve Austin, I felt like everybody kind of had, like they loved Stone Cold. And I mean, The Undertaker was always great. I remember Kane being like a really big deal when he hit the scene because it was like, oh
Hmm.
my God, here's a guy that's scarier than The Undertaker. Um, so he was rad. Remember, what was his name? Val or Val, something like that. I
Val
forget his name.
Venus. Yep.
Val Vetus, yeah. He used to come out with like the Ho Train or something, not the Ho Train, but he had like all
No,
these
no,
like
no. That
porn
was the
stars that walked out with
Godfather.
him.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Godfather had the Ho
The
Train, but
God.
Val Venus had like,
These are different sexual characters. You gotta you gotta show each one proper respect. Okay, Val Venus was porn
you're
star,
absolutely
came out
right.
with Jenna Jameson
Yes.
sometimes,
Yeah.
and the Godfather had his hose.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, so those were my guys. Those are the ones that I was really into. Oh, and the oddities. I fucking loved the oddities when they came out.
Yeah, I thought it was so cool at the time. Before ICP got like became like the redheaded stepchild of metal. I love the oddities. I loved ICP with them, and I just love the gimmick of embracing being a freak.
Yeah.
And I still have that theme song. I get it stuck in my head every once in a while, with that, like the carnival music on acid type stuff.
Well, and they were intimidating. You didn't know what they were gonna do. Like they were wild card wrestlers too.
Yeah. And it's crazy that the guy, Gold, I believe was his name, that was just Earthquake. That was the former John Tenta. Yeah, there was a lot of great. It was just like a fun variety show at the time.
Yeah, and it just kind of seemed like too, like they were willing to try anything, and like if something stuck, then they would go with it and let that character play out the stories. I recently watched like a in-depth YouTube video about Al Snow and like the story behind him and stuff, and that was fascinating. Something that they had no expectation for taking off, and he just kind of did to see how it would go. It was just like a random weird character, and people just fell in love with it. Like I don't know, I don't know. I thought that was a cool story.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm gathering you didn't watch WCW that much?
I did. It was always like the thing that I watched during commercials for Raw. I liked the NWO. Like I was a fan of like the NWO crew. And then I always liked Razor Ramon. Like I liked him when he was with WWF, and I think it was Diesel before he was Kevin Nash. That was the tag team that I always played when I played wrestling games on Super Nintendo.
So interesting though, like, so WWE was your priority, or WWF at the time, and then when they're a commercial, be like, oh, let's see what the other guys are doing. It wasn't like a half and half.
No, not really. I always kind of felt like the WCW was like the VH1 to the MTV.
That's an interesting analogy, because, and I'm sure on WCW's end that was intentional, because I do remember Eric Bischoff went out of his way to make sure there's no cursing, that they banned the lewd gestures like the crotch chops, because they didn't want to lose the advertisers, whereas WWE was behind in the ratings, so they were just like, whatever it takes.
Well, and I like WCW was on TNT, which I mean, like that, like that was like, it was like wrestling and old westerns. That's pretty much all that channel played. And and then WWF at the time was on the USA Network, which was kind of like just trying to figure themselves out. Like, they had like Saturday morning cartoons. Like they didn't know what the hell they were doing for a channel. So I don't think they cared. They're like, as long as you're bringing in ratings and people are watching, because we need to keep this channel afloat.
Yeah. And also, I thought what was so cool, especially with WWE, is they would integrate a lot of nu metal into the show. And I felt so seen as a nu metal fan, as a wrestling fan, because, one of the most iconic video packages in WWE history is the WrestleMania package, WrestleMania 17. And it's My Way by Limp Bizkit is the soundtrack, and people still reference that package and parody it and stuff because it was so iconic. I feel like I wouldn't go as far as to say that wrestling got me into nu metal, but it encouraged my nu metal fandom. I feel absolutely.
And like those were the wrestlers that I tended to like a little bit more too. The ones that came out to like the edgier, heavier sounding metal music, And I used to get those like, they're not really like sample packs, but they'd be like the CDs that had all the intro music on them.
Yeah, the compilations. So you could
like listen. Yeah. So I used to buy those up like whenever they'd come out with new ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And like some of those tracks, Jim, and I love that they would get like guys from Saliva or Our Lady Peace to come in and do a guest collab with the producer that they had there, Jim Johnson, who was just such a whiz at making great music.
I remember there was this band, I think they were called the DTE. I think they were the guys that did like the Degeneration X intro sound. Right. And I remember when I first heard it, I was like, that sounds identical to Rage Against the Machine.
Yeah.
Like they sounded so close to it. It took me a while to figure out that it wasn't even that band. It was this completely other band that was literally their only claim to fame, was that one song that they got to do for DX.
Yeah. What's so crazy is that band performed at WrestleMania 14. They introduced, they performed DX to the ring, and the lead singer even looks like Zach De La Rocha. Like he was going for the same hairstyle and everything. It was surreal to see, because obviously Rage Against the Machine would never ever agree to something like this. Is completely antithesis to their politics. So they just had to get a knockoff. But if you got to get a knockoff, that's a pretty sick knockoff.
Yeah, it was pretty close. It was pretty damn close to it. Probably helped pull some people over to Rage Against the Machine, to be honest with you. Like if you were a fan of
I'm
New
sure.
Generation X and you didn't know that that wasn't Rage Against the Machine, you'd probably go and try to find out who that band was and wind up listening to Rage Against the Machine at some point.
Exactly. And also, this was the era of like Napster and Kazaa. So you might put in DX theme and it's labeled Rage Against the Machine DX theme. And you're like,
Yeah,
oh, okay, let me let me look
exactly.
up a bunch of. That's honestly how I got into Norma Jean. I forget what it was that I downloaded, but instead it was Bless the Smarter, Kiss This Child. And I was like, holy moly, this is this is way better than whatever I was looking for. Just
Yeah.
mislabeling stuff.
That record changed a lot of things when that record came out.
Agreed. I think its influence is still felt to this day.
Oh
Just
yeah.
how many
Yeah.
bands propped up. I feel like all the like pseudo Christian hardcore bands, like they all came out of Norma Jean. Like all those. I can't even like Memphis Maya. Like bands like that. Like
Hmm.
Devil Wears Prada. Like all those bands. I feel owe something to Norma Jean or Miss May, not Memphis May. Miss May was the band I was thinking of.
Yeah, I mean, like they kind of like popularized. We call them panic chords. Those like really like screechy things. Like they kind of made it like, oh, look, you can write an entire song with just open chokes and panic chords, and it
Yeah.
still sounds amazing.
I feel like I didn't realize there was a name for the panic core. I always
That's
call it
what.
just the math core riff, that wah, 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 right? Like the yeah, right. And I
That's what
love
we
that
call it
sound so
internally.
much. Yeah, I love it so much, and it brings me back to that time. It's such a great. It's also I feel very old now because it's 2024. That means 2004 was 20 years ago. Like we're fully in the mathcore nostalgia era. Like literally, like Dillinger Escape Plan is getting back together to play their first full length. So it's like we're now we are where, to put it into context, when we were kids, where glam metal was when we were kids is now where mathcore is, which I don't like that. I don't
No,
like that feeling. You know?
no. But the one thing that I do like though is that it seems like a lot of those bands were like either teens or in their early 20s. So now, 20 some years later, they're like all those dudes are just in their 40s. So
Yeah.
like what's kind of nice is the bands that are reuniting. It's cool to be able to get to see those bands, bands that I never thought that I'd ever get to see, let alone see again. Like I got to see Botch twice last year, which I never even got to see them once when they were active.
Yeah, I
So
never thought I would ever see Botch live, and then when I saw them, it was so surreal because, I don't know, truthfully, I haven't really listened to Botch that much in recent years, just because I've digested it. But
right.
when they came around, when they were about to come around, I was like, oh, let me put this on again just to recall. And it's like, first of all, I remembered everything, and
Hmm.
I was like, oh my god, this is so great! Like this had such an effect on me, and then seeing it live made me feel like a kid again because I never had a context to how those songs sounded live. And
Right.
it really felt like going to some of your first underground shows and like hearing the riffs that seem familiar, but they're a little faster. They're a little like crunchier, something a little more oomph to them. And that was so exciting to hear those songs, which I only heard in one context, which is how it was recorded on the album, and hear them messing around with it and like, not necessarily being in time or whatever. And I loved it.
Well, and also, like you only kind of have the concept of the recording. So seeing them try to figure out how to perform it live now,
Yes.
I mean, like not to compare us to Botch by any means, but like, we recently have been going through the process of trying to relearn these songs from 18 years ago. And there are just parts that we're like, okay, we just got to commit that this is how we're going to play it now because we don't remember exactly what we did 18 years ago. And,
Hmm.
Botch was definitely a bigger band. So who knows what kind of like material they had saved. They might have had, tab books or something like that, or they have plenty of video footage that they can review to figure out where their hands were on their instruments. But I'm sure that they probably still had to be like, okay, how are we going to pull this part off that's layered multiple different ways on the record? I'm sure that you noticed that their drummer played a lot of piano through the whole set. So I thought that was really cool. I thought that was interesting. I'm sure they probably didn't do that when they toured back in the day. They might have, but I don't. I don't think so.
Did you find that challenging, like playing the stuff that you like? How the fuck did I do this? or was it just like putting on an old glove?
Some songs were like putting on an old glove, and some songs were like, I don't know what the hell we did there. I don't remember the riff at all. And it took a couple times of sitting down and trying to figure it out by ear. I'd bring it into my DAW and put a certain chunk on loop and just sit and play what I thought was going on until I found everything sounded right. And then I would share that with our bass player, and then he would try to see if it worked. And sometimes he'd send back and he'd be like, this note's off, or let's play it like this. And obviously he's doing it all on bass. So then I'd have to take what he wrote on 4 strings and figure out how it fits on 6 strings. So yeah,
Nice.
it was definitely an interesting process to try and sort some of it out. But it was a lot of fun. It was really challenging. Like most of the time I'm usually just writing. With my current band, we just write the songs, commit to the parts, and then rehearse them and play them. So trying to sit down and learn these songs and figure them out in a collaborative way, not only was challenging, but it was just like just really fun to do as a musician. So it kind of like added to the excitement of the show coming up in a couple weeks.
One act I forgot to mention from the Attitude Era that I feel is very pertinent to this discussion is the Headbangers. I mean, it was like total representation. Like the
Yeah,
Headbangers
the
were my
Headbangers.
guys. I was so excited for them, and that they their finisher was the stage dive, and which was like one of the guys would get on the top rope, and then the other guy had the opponent on the on the ring, and the one guy would pick the opponent up in a power bomb, and the guy on the top rope would hit a leg drop as the power bomb is being dropped. Which
Yep, I remember
that's not
that.
really a stage dive. I guess the stage dive is from the top rope. He's diving, but I'm not sure what
Yeah,
other
that's
pun you can make.
it's funny looking back now on wrestling, and you realize how much of that stuff was people that had no idea what they were talking about trying
Yes.
to, like, I heard that word once, like they do stage dives, right? Yeah, punk guys do that.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I was just, oh, Marilyn Manson's big. All right, let's get some guys in skirts. Quick.
Yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, like that wasn't like Al Snow part of like a little group of like weird misfit people?
Oh, that was the Job Squad. He
Yeah,
was,
yeah, yeah.
yes, with like the Blue Meanie, Hardcore Holly.
Yep,
That was just like, we're
yep.
losers. They were literally,
Yeah.
we're meant to lose.
Yeah, there was that. And then I remember the Hardy Brothers, and I remember having a huge crush on what was her name, Lita?
Lita, yes.
Yeah.
It's so
I was
funny how
like,
much
oh
Lita comes
man.
up on this show.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, no, Hardy Boys rule too. Same reason, because it felt like, oh, these are us. These are my guys. Like it was always
Yep.
cool to see that. And even though WWE was the essence of the vibe of it was metal, they were like the metal dudes, whereas everyone else
Oh
was just
yeah.
like wrestlers. Yeah.
Right.
And also, it was cool because I remember seeing like magazine articles where they were like, "Yeah, we all went to Pearl Jam," and it's like, "Wow, they actually like real bands. It's not like, Hall and Oates or whatever. Like
Yeah.
they're living the gimmick, so to speak."
Right, right. It's not just like weird skinny guys with long hair putting on an act. Like they actually understand some of the music that they're portraying.
Yeah. So, do you remember like how you got out of it? Just like growing older, or like what got you disinterested in pro wrestling?
The band just got busy. So I grew
Hmm.
up in a really small town, so there wasn't a lot to do except for, like video games and wrestling.
Where did you
Um,
grow up?
a small town in Michigan called Ionia. It's like right between
Okay.
Lansing and Grand Rapids. Yeah, there just wasn't anything to do. So, like you kind of found your way either going towards sports, video games, or at the time there were alternative sports. So it was like skateboarding and aggressive inline skating and things like that. We started the summer break before senior year, I think is when we started to start working on music and playing shows. And so a lot of my time got taken up doing that. And so it was just hard to keep up with these like ritual things of every single Monday and every single Thursday watching wrestling. And eventually, I kind of like lost touch with the storylines. And so like if you try to go into wrestling blind and you have no idea what any of the storylines are, it's just hard to stay like invested. And that was kind of like when I fell off. And every once in a while, like I'll still like kind of like try to tune in and find out what's going on in the wrestling world. I still have a lot of friends that are really into it. So if I want to have a fun conversation, I'll bring up wrestling and let them just go. It's interesting to watch them try to recapture certain things. Like you can see them bringing characters on that they're trying to recapture an old character that they did during the Attitude Era. They're like, well, this worked once, and like who they just brought The Rock back, right?
Yeah,
Like he's now like a
absolutely.
commissioner or something, or he owns it, or I don't remember like what position they gave
Well,
him.
no, this isn't storyline. He's legitimately like not The Rock. Dwayne Johnson, the human being, is on the
Yeah,
board of directors of TKO, which is the parent company of WWE. This isn't storyline. Like he's literally on the board. But I think that's like kind of like a figurehead thing, just because they wanted him to come back and do some matches, and they'd have to pay him so much that they were like, well, why don't we just put you on the board? Like, hey,
yeah,
how about
yeah.
like you help us out? We'll put you on the board. Like it's a trade off because they're trying to use his star power to get publicity, and it kind of blew up in their faces a little bit because the crowd wanted a different match for WrestleMania. They wanted Cody Rhodes against the world champion Roman Reigns, and but to The Rock's credit, he adjusted. He's now they kind of mishmashed the story now where he's a bad guy again, which is surprising because I didn't think they were gonna go that way, and he cut a very 1999 promo this past week on SmackDown, which I would suggest seek it out because it's very fun. Like
I
you don't
will.
need to know the storyline because he's just insulting the crowd like he did 25 years ago. So, and it was really like I truthfully, as someone who I would consider myself a hardcore wrestling fan, I follow every week and I follow the backstage stuff. Like I'm kind of over The Rock. And again, I say this with kid gloves. Like I'm not saying I don't think he should be on WWE. I obviously understand his value and why they would want him and how they're bringing him back, not for me, but for casual fans, maybe people like you who haven't tuned out but heard The Rock is here, like, and maybe will tune back in. But it just seems like for the longest time, he was just doing the hits, like it was like watching Kiss the last few years. It's like, all right, we get it, like enough. But this new change in character is the first time that I found myself really looking forward to The Rock. So, in an odd way, even though we're not getting this Roman Reigns versus The Rock match at WrestleMania, I'm more excited about The Rock's character than I have been in 15 years.
I mean, that's it's cool to see them do that and bring him back like that, and to have him enthusiastically being involved. Because
Yeah.
I mean, prior to that, he would just show up for anniversary, like I think it was like the 30th anniversary of WrestleMania or something like that. Like he should, I don't know, I made up a number, but he would
Yeah,
do
no,
things
you're
like
talking. He
that.
shows up, he makes fun of some new wrestler, and then the wrestler never gets to get his like heat back or whatever. So it was just
Hmm.
it was so silly. It was like, and it was the same kind of like the same hits of jokes. There was no new material, and so for someone that watches all the time, it was a little annoying. And I felt in a way a little unfair to these new wrestlers that are working hard all year to try to look credible to the fans. And then in 5 minutes, The Rock completely kills their credibility for months,
Yeah,
and I know I sound like like a snarky, wrestling fan, but I I can't help it.
yeah, but it's pretty transparent that it's like an attention grab. They know that they're
Yeah.
gonna get media attention. They know that they're like gonna get some hits on YouTube from it, and nostalgia is gonna kick in for people that are gonna want to talk about it and stuff. So they know what they're doing as far as like that strategy goes. But for
Yeah.
people that are avid fans that watch every week, like you said, the novelty is like worn off a long time ago, and it's just
Exactly.
annoying.
Exactly that. Yeah, so but now they've corrected it. Like now I feel the Rock is good. I'm curious. I'm like, wow, where are they going to go with this? I'm hearing he's going to be doing a tag match instead of a singles match, which sure, fine. Probably better for him, like less risk of injury. He's
Yeah,
51 years old, so maybe a 30-minute match isn't the best thing for him to be doing.
probably not. Yeah, I mean, one people's elbow, and he probably wouldn't be able to bend his elbow again.
Yeah.
um, yeah, I mean, I remember it's funny because I remember when I was younger and I got into wrestling, I never knew like if I could trust those official positions that they gave to different wrestlers. Like so,
Like, what
like
do
I
you mean?
remember like Eric Bischoff. I never actually knew that he was the commissioner. I always thought that they just gave
Oh yeah, he
him.
was like the president of the company, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, but I honestly was like, well, if you wouldn't send the president of the company out to get hurt, like in a wrestling, you know what I mean? Like any other business, the owner of the
Right.
company isn't behind the counter serving drinks and making food. Like,
Typically, yeah.
especially something like big. Yeah, it's like I and then in wrestling nature, it's also all those characters are made up, all their stories are made up. So I never really knew what to trust. I never knew like if they were giving like Triple H just this arbitrary title because they wanted him to be important in the eyes of the viewers.
No, man, he's running the ship right now. He's
Yeah,
basically
yeah.
doing all the creative. Yeah, it's crazy. It's kind of wild to think that DX is running WWE now, because Shawn Michaels is the one. He's the one running their development league where all their newer stars like form their character and everything. He's the one in charge of that. So it's kind of wild. The two of them are just steering the ship.
Is that next, like NXT or something like
yes,
that?
yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes. That's cool. So it sounds like while you're not following week to week, you have like one tippy toe in the door and like you kind of passively keep up with it. So is it just basically like your friends posting on social media and stuff, how you kind of see what's going on, or whoever, like friends of yours that tell you about stuff?
I think it's just like my algorithms. So like I'll get nostalgic and go and watch, like the DX highlights on YouTube, or the Stone Cold highlights. Or I thought like one of the coolest things I've ever seen was that video where what's his name, Nick Foley sat down with the Undertaker and they rewatched
Oh
their
yeah,
legendary match, like the Hell in the
the Hell
Cell
in the
match.
Cell. Yeah,
And like they're like just like elbowing and goofing around and like talking shit about themselves. They're like, "Oh God, I did so horrible right here. I hardly sold that. I can't believe I did this," stuff like that. And you're just like, that match was just so iconic, and like everybody watching believed 100% that you two hated each other, and like you were trying to kill one another, and like here you are just chumming it up, like, "Oh man, like like here's that part where you can totally tell you didn't even hit me," and like things like that.
yeah. I think I've shared this on this podcast before, but I remember watching that live, the King of the Ring, with their infamous Hell in the Cell match. And when he got thrown off the cage, I was in my room. I ran out. I've never marked out this hard as like a 15-year-old kid. I ran out of my room and I was like, "Mom, Dad, you have to come in here. You have to see this. I look, I know you say wrestling is fake, but this is not fake. Like, you have to see what they just did. They threw a guy off a cage. Oh my God."
Yeah. So yeah, but so between like all the like me going and watching that stuff on YouTube, the random things will come up on Reels and TikTok and things like that. I just think it's like gets fed to me through the algorithms. And then occasionally something like sensational will happen in the wrestling world that'll break through like major news anyways. So like that'll draw me into like catch up a little bit of what's happening. And there's also, and I really appreciate this. I know that there's a lot of people that are really big fans of wrestling and probably a lot of wrestlers themselves that don't like the behind the curtain stuff that's happening right now. But there's just so many, the Vice shows. There's a lot of YouTube faux documentary things, and like just stuff that like the actual like WWE and WCW has put out over the years, where they kind of really break down behind the scenes how the wrestling world works.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fascinating to be that 14, 15-year-old kid that never could quite figure out how they choreographed these 30-minute, 40-minute long matches, how they would plan out these super elaborate stories, how they would play off, okay, is that person actually hurt? Is that part of the story? And then you find out later, like, oh no, that person got really hurt and they had to rewrite the whole story for a month and a
Right.
half because that person had to recover. And then you learn the terminology that they use and how they would sell people and how they would put them over and things like that. And like I got really, really fascinated by all of that stuff over like the last couple of years. So anytime that I see a cool behind the scenes clip come up on YouTube, or like the Vice Dark Side of the Ring series that they did,
Yeah.
like that stuff is all fascinating, and you learn so much about like what the so in the music world, most people that just listen to bands, they really only kind of understand like what's happening at their major venues and what's going on with like music videos on YouTube and stuff like that. Like they don't really understand how like the underground local metal scene operates and what it's like to be a small band that's just grinding away trying to get out of their hometown. And when you learn that that exists in the wrestling world, you're just like, okay, well, what's that world like? Like
Right.
where are those small town wrestling federations that are they're living off of a 50-person attendance once a week,
Mm-hmm.
and things like that.
That
And
to me is like the real wrestling. That's like where you really got to fucking put in the work, like
yeah,
you can't half-ass it there because all your flaws are right there. Like people are right in front of the ring. You can't hide it.
well, and it's also, like they're trying out different characters to see what'll stick. They're still learning how to be a very entertaining wrestler. to get, they need to get heat, they need to get attention, in hopes to be brought up to a different federation, and then eventually they can try to like get a TV contract or whatever. But yeah, I mean, like when you're 15, 16 years old, you don't know about any of that stuff. You don't understand how any of the wrestling world works. You think you go to a wrestling school and then they put you out on TV. Like
Yeah,
you wind up,
exactly.
you pick a federation and that's the road you go down. Um, but yeah, I mean, like there are people that to this day are still grinding and nobody knows who the hell they are for wrestlers.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say with bands, it's like it's a
Yep.
very similar trajectory of having to work these VFW halls and make enough of an audience that like some bigwig notices you and gets you a shot to the bigger venues.
Yeah. Well, and then the whole process of learning how to do all of that stuff, like, yeah, there's plenty of people that can teach you how to play your instrument, but nobody can really sit down and teach you how to be in a band.
Yeah.
So you can
Yeah,
go
and
to a
there's a whole
wrestling
bit.
school, but that doesn't mean you have the personality to be a star.
Right. You might have the athletics down, but there's more to it than that. Awesome, man. Well, this has been a great, very enlightening chat. It's been very fun to look back. I like getting a little nostalgic here on the show, and obviously, if you're in the Michigan area, you can get nostalgic with Flesh and Blood Robot. Their big reunion show is on March 17th at Grand Rapids, Michigan's The Pyramid Scheme, with From a Second Story Window, Nights Like These, Heartsick, Dust Spiders, and Strangers. Is there a possibility of new Flesh and Blood Robot music at
Yeah,
all?
so the last song that we wrote as a band, the only recording that we have of it is a live recording from a show that we did in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think where we've all determined that we definitely want to like a track that, like proper,
Mm-hmm.
um, at the least, at the absolute least. We all want to write new music, but our bass player lives in Denver. Fox and Nico, they live in Michigan. I live in Chicago. So, we're gonna try to write things over. We all have DAWs, so we can all like write and record in our home studios. So we're gonna try to write things that way, and then get together occasionally and see how it goes. And we're gonna try to play some shows here and there. If a cool opportunity comes up and it kind of works for everybody's schedules and lives. But yeah, at the very least, we're gonna definitely figure out how to do If I Lived in the '80s and track that properly. So there's a good recording of it out there.
Great. That's awesome. Well, I hope that much like with pro wrestling, a new audience finds your music. I was listening to some of the stuff in anticipation, and it works. It fits right in with all the bands that we mentioned earlier this episode in terms of the mathcore sound. So it was exciting to check it out and find out that there's still this plethora of mathcore bands that I didn't dig into 20 years ago that you could listen to.
Yeah, it's funny because part of the promotion for this show was like kind of discovering some Facebook groups that we can go in
Hmm.
go in and talk to their members and let people know that hey, we're a band and we're doing things. And I discovered that there's like a good handful of very popular Facebook groups that are still keeping that whole scene alive of being like, hey, do you remember this band? If you like that band, check this band out from 20 years ago. They were great, but they never got out of their hometown. And you're like, wow, there was a crap ton of amazing bands that, did the same thing that we did. They were
Yeah.
active and really, really into it because MySpace was really helpful at the time, and then just kind of went away.
What are some? I know Mathcore Index is one of those. They do a really good job of keeping me abreast of metal math metal bands. What are some of these other Facebook pages if you remember them off the top of your head?
I remember like one was literally called like MySpace Metal of the Aughts. You know what I mean? Things like that. I feel like that was the era that we didn't call it this at the time. That was the era that sort of sparked deathcore.
Hmm.
So if you go into any of the deathcore Facebook groups, they're usually talking about bands from that era because
It's
like
true.
there was so many of them. And no, there's some great deathcore bands out there, but there's also like a lot of them. They all kind of sound the same to me at this point. So
Yeah.
like going back and listening to those, and I don't think that like not trying to take away anything from them, but I think it like a lot of it has to do with like the recording and the production. I think
Hmm.
that a lot of bands just
Great point.
they aren't the same, but they sound similar because they're all trying to achieve the same kind of sound with the recording. When the early 2000s, nobody knew what the hell they were doing with that kind of music, so every producer was kind of doing something different. So many bands would come out sounding like if you saw them on the same bill, they all sounded the same, but when you listen to their records, they sounded completely different.
Yeah, that's a good point. Awesome, man. Well, any final words before we exit the pit?
No, I appreciate it. I appreciate this podcast. It was really cool to have a conversation about wrestling while also discussing metal and getting a chance to talk about what we're doing with bands. So thanks for having me on.
Awesome. I'll definitely include a link to the band's website in the description. So if you want to check out more Flesh and Blood Robot, you can find it there, or on Instagram. Flesh and Blood Robot Metal is the username. So check out Flesh and Blood Robot. Nick, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for entering the pit.
Thank you.